We're going to take you now to the next session, which is Muskegon Lake AOC restoration.
Community-based partnerships formed in the early 90s to start addressing the pollution problems that we had in Muskegon Lake once we learned that it was an area of concern. And it had been designated as such, back in the mid-80s. And so one of the early community-based partnerships that formed was the Muskegon Lake Watershed Partnership. And that group has met every month since 1992 to set targets, to plan projects, organize funding, and to continue to build and strengthen the partnerships that we have with local governments, universities, state and federal, regional agencies, and nonprofits. So the work that we've been able to achieve recently in Muskegon Lake, I think, was set up well because of the early planning and the partnerships that were built before we had any funding, before we had the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative or the Great Lakes Legacy Act. So we got started early on with a real dedicated group of local volunteers and different local organizations on the planning that was needed to kind of facilitate the progress that we were able to finally make just in the last decade or so. So, what happened? Why was Muskegon Lake designated as one of the Great Lakes areas of concern? Well, the Muskegon River was heavily logged, and millions and millions of board feet of lumber were actually created in Muskegon Lake from the logs that came down the Muskegon River. There were 47 sawmills along the shoreline of Muskegon Lake by the later 1800s. Between about 1870 and 1890, the population of Muskegon County was 37,000. That's probably about the size of the city of Muskegon at this point. But all of the sawdust, the slabs of wood, and other waste from the sawmill era was left behind. And you can see on the slide you can see on the slide of the old sawmills that were there in 1888, kind of the outline of the piers that and the sawmills that lined the lake. And later, additional fill occurred, and the little slide in the lower right corner indicates the fill that eventually occurred after additional industry came. So then a natural extension of the past logging industry was to establish a new industry to replace the jobs that we lost. And World War II was upon us, and we had a lot of sand available, and we needed engines and parts for engines and trucks and tanks for the war effort and then beyond. So the pattern of filling the lake kind of continued as we started seeing industry locate on the lake shore. We had a paper mill that had already established on the lake shore, and the common practice for all of the waste material and the discharge was to use the lake for disposal. And so that continued on. And then during the 1970s, Muskegon County established a state-of-the-art county wastewater treatment plant. And so the clarity of Muskegon Lake improved dramatically in the 70s, and people started thinking, maybe this is worth cleaning up, and they started thinking about brownfield redevelopment and cleaning up the lakeshore, getting rid of some of the industry that by then had started to close down. So we saw another kind of industry fade away from the sawmill to the heavier industry. And so now we have this blue economy era where we're seeing more parks, marinas, restaurants, hotels. We have the Lakeshore Trail bike path that is established between the Muskegon River all the way to Lake Michigan along the south side of Muskegon Lake, and that's connected to other regional bike path trails. We have water trails. Grand Valley State University is on the shoreline, both the Annis Water Resources Institute as well as the Michigan Alternative and Renewable Energy Center. So we're poised well for the new blue economy era and hopefully a more sustainable future for our economy locally and for the environment. And the reason I think that we will be successful in this is because we continue to do planning, not just for Muskegon Lake, but as a community-wide, as a region, and as a county. And we have a Muskegon area-wide land use plan that was recently updated, and a very key important part of that plan has to do with natural resources and the environment. another section on quality of life, economic development, transportation, and they all tie together in a way that I think bodes very well for the future economic development and environment of Muskegon Lake. So, Muskegon Lake, we had 6 BUIs originally in 1985. Over the course of the 80s and early 90s, we identified 3 additional problems, and so there were 9 beneficial use impairments by the time we established targets for what we needed to achieve to remove those. We worked closely with the Muskegon Conservation District, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, and the DNR. We worked with Grand Valley State University Water Resources Institute to do some additional sampling and studies to kind of establish a new baseline in the early 90s to see if we still had the same problems we had in 1985 when we were listed as an area of concern. And we found that we still did have some problems. So once we identified those problems, we started meeting and making plans to correct those problems. And then later on, when we were able to use funding through the Great Lakes Legacy Act and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we were able to make some real progress. So we've removed 3 beneficial use impairments: fish and wildlife consumption, dredging, and the drinking water consumption BUIs. We have completed a lot of fish and wildlife habitat restoration on Muskegon Lake, and we have 4 other major projects planned now on the Bear Creek part of the watershed, Veterans Memorial Park, the Muskegon Lake Lumber Era Mill Debris Project, and a Muskegon River Wetland Restoration Project. And so we hope to achieve those in the coming years. Muskegon Lake is listed in the Great Lakes Action Plan to be delisted by 2019, and we are working every day to make sure that we reach that goal, if not before 2019. The degradation of benthos is being worked on. We've already completed 2 large-scale contaminated sediment cleanups, Ruddiman Creek and Division Street Outfall, and we have another one, Zephyr, underway. The Department of Environmental Quality here in Michigan is a partner with the U.S. EPA and the Great Lakes Legacy Act, and we're working on a project in the Ryerson area of Muskegon Lake with some private partners to be a sponsor of this cleanup for that part of the lake. So we're working on degradation of aesthetics, eutrophication, and beach closings as well. We don't really have beach closings on Muskegon Lake. That's kind of a terminology that's used in the area of concern world, but we do have some E. coli problems in a tributary to the lake, and we've identified the final areas where we have some illicit connections between the sanitary and storm sewer. And this month, I'm happy to say that we will be voting as a local community to go ahead and work with the DEQ and the EPA to initiate the removal of that BUI. So we're happy that we'll be able to celebrate that success again soon. But before we had the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we identified 3 areas that were key to clean up that had contaminated sediments. Ruddiman Creek, because it was a recreational area in a residential community. Ryerson, because of the economic development potential in the area. And then the Division Street Outfall, because it was right in the heart of downtown, and it was a place that was used for marina and other recreational shoreline activities. And since that time, when we set those goals and identified those cleanups with the funding available through the GLRI, we have been able to accomplish those. And you see the yellow dots here, 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 and here. Those are the Legacy Act sites. But all of the red dots are where we've been able to clean up shoreline debris, broken concrete, foundry slag, sawmill waste, and restore a native plant shoreline habitat and make that as contiguous as possible along the shoreline for the benefit of fish and wildlife and for the beauty that can be seen all along the Lakeshore Trail as you walk and bike down to Lake Michigan. We also have some upcoming projects that I mentioned in orange on this map, and the many partners that we work with. You can see many logos down here. We work with a lot of different partners. The Great Lakes Commission has been a great partner. NOAA, I mentioned the EPA. Many local communities and foundations have helped us on these projects, not to mention the many landowners who have provided us the space to work on and permanently protected that restoration with conservation easements. So Ruddiman Creek, the cleanup was completed in 2006, the second Legacy Act cleanup, I believe, in the state of Michigan, and the first in Muskegon Lake. And we removed PCBs and some heavy metals. The Division Street Outfall right in the heart of downtown. And you see kind of the footprint of where there was mercury and PAHs and all those different sampling points that ended up not needing cleanup. This is Heritage Landing, a big, very popular county park that's located right here. And then the YMCA and Hartshore Marina, located right in this area here. So it really is a real recreational, widely used area by the region, not just the local community. So it was great to see that get cleaned up, and mercury was removed and PAHs were removed there. And we're currently working with the EPA on another partnership for another portion of the lake. We call it Ryerson because Ryerson Creek outlets into the lake right here. And this was the old Teledyne Continental Motors right here. This point right here is that point right there. And you can see how all this fill was put into the lake. All of this is unnatural fill in the lake. It was a large company and provided a lot of jobs, but that was at one time lake. So even the building I work in up here, I think, was the lake once. So we're excited about this new Legacy Act cleanup under the GLRI because we have so much potential for economic development down at the Ryerson area. Here's Ryerson Creek coming in. We're looking at possibly cleaning up sediments in this area and this peninsula of unnatural fill. If you were there, you would see broken concrete and slag and all kinds of different scrap material. That will probably come out and will restore wetland in this little bay. And that will help spur on more development here where we have law offices. We have a LEED certified condominium in here now, the Energy Center. Over here is a marina and a hotel and a restaurant. And there's plans right now underway to do some more residential development here and other future mixed uses for development in this area here. So we're really hoping that the cleanup offshore here will help spur on more development at that part of the lake. A Legacy Act project is also underway upstream of Muskegon Lake. It was one of the sites that we added later. We didn't know that we had contaminated sediments in that area. It was a site that the state of Michigan was monitoring, and they were cleaning up groundwater, but there had been some earlier spills and some things that occurred where there were some sediments contaminated. So we're happy to say that the state is matching the Legacy Act to clean that up now. And we just recently, with the help of the EPA, sampled offshore from the paper mill to see what we have happening offshore from that site. And the paper mill property is a very, very large piece of property that is now no longer in operation. And there's a lot of emphasis on what we're going to do to redevelop that property on Muskegon Lake right now. So, fish and wildlife habitat. We developed a fish and wildlife habitat restoration strategy from about, I would say, between 2006 and 2008. We were working on the plan, and we involved scientists, we involved community members, landowners. So I think the plan was very good because it was based in a lot of natural resource priorities, science, as well as kind of community desires, and it made it real feasible. So we set some real quantifiable targets in that project, brought together a lot of landowners, and we're still implementing that project today and having a lot of success with shoreline habitat restoration. And there's just a few images of some of the projects very soon after restoration. That's the former paper mill. Actually, most of that's been knocked down now. A nice wetland across the bay from that. This is when it was first established. This is down at Heritage Landing, downtown, a park. This, again, is Grand Trunk. We'll be visiting some of these sites tomorrow afternoon if you're on the field trip. And I think it'll be really nice to be there and see how it's evolved now over the last couple of years. A lot of the work we do has to do with the sawmill industry still. There's still a lot of wood in the lake. In some cases, it's smothering the benthos. And so the wood that we remove from the lake, as much as possible, we reuse it. And some of it's been repurposed by artists Some of it's been repurposed by Pigeon Hill Brewery, and we're going to visit that on our field trip tomorrow to see how they created tables and some of the furnishings and some of the decor on the walls. Not for barrels, beer barrels. We could probably do that, though. We hope to be doing some more of this kind of work soon. We're working with the Great Lakes Commission and NOAA on a regional partnership, and we have, maybe you can tell me if we already have a contract. I don't even know, but it should be hitting my desk soon, right, Matt? Okay.
I'll put him on the spot. Right.
Because there's a lot more of this wood in a spot on the lake where we did partial restoration, but we want to complete it. We want to do it this year. We are really all about staying on target with this delisting of the area of concern by 2019. And these are large projects that take a lot of planning, design, and monitoring. You know, you don't want to just delist before you have a chance to take a look and see if everything was successful. But just carrying out projects in Michigan when we have winter and we have times when you can't dredge the lake because there are fish spawning. So it really restricts the time that you can have big machinery on the streets because of frost laws. And so timing is really critical with these big, large-scale projects. So they do take more time. You think you could get it done in a year. It might be more like 2 years. So there's a handout that talks more about the before and after. I think everyone has one of those. We restored nearly 2.5 miles of shoreline, 208,000 tons of rubble, 52 acres of wetlands. A big part of these projects, and this one was one of the bigger ones, was funded by NOAA with ERA money, the stimulus funds. We are really just starting to get to work with Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding with these new projects that are coming up. The majority of the work we did before was through NOAA, but it was with the ERA money. And we had a $10 million grant through the Great Lakes Commission to the West Michigan Shoreline Regional Development Commission to carry out that work. And as a part of that, Grand Valley State University did a study and determined that we would have a $12 million increase in property values from the softening of the shoreline and the cleaning up, and that we would have over $1 million in new recreational spending annually, nearly 65,000 new visitors annually, and $66 million in economic benefits over 10 years, which is more than a 6-to-1 return on the investment. So just to kind of wrap things up, there's so much more to talk about with partners, how we work with communities, members, schools, students. We placed interpretive signage along the shoreline as part of our recent grant with NOAA and ERA. There's a QR code where people can go to the Convention and Visitor Bureau website and find out more about what we're doing on Muskegon Lake. The economic benefit story is part of that, and that's available through the signage and the websites. And our new projects that are coming up are going to be really exciting. A fish passage project to improve wetlands and fish passage and water quality at Veterans Memorial Park, a real historically significant prized area in our community along the river, just right where the river enters Muskegon Lake. And then I'm going to let Al speak a little bit more about how science is part of these projects, and in particular for an upcoming project that's under design now. We've been working with Cardno JF New to design the Bear Creek Hydrologic Reconnection and Restoration Project, originally looking primarily at fish passage and wetland restoration as a goal, and then realizing that we could do so much more with water quality improvements if we do this right and integrate science and create a design that will also meet water quality goals as well as habitat goals. So with that, I will turn it over to Al.
Thanks, Kathy. So we'll just take questions at the end if that's okay after all the presentations.
Thanks, Mike. I think hopefully everybody in this room recognizes the importance of science and restoration. One of the bugaboos that we've been dealing with, at least amongst the scientific community in the Great Lakes, is that sometimes it's not as instilled within the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects as we'd like. And one of the things that I hear a lot is, Al, please do something, but no more studies. I don't care what you do, just no more studies. And the fact is, you do care what we do, because if we don't have the science embedded in what the restoration activities should be, then we're going to spend a lot of money wastefully. And so I would argue that a modest investment in science can go a long way. And that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about today. We can talk about this at a Great Lakes Basin-wide scale, but in this case, we'll talk about the Bear Lake muck fields in particular. I like this quote as far as why science is important. It's from Peter Glick, and he said, "It's very difficult to make good public policy without good science. And it's even harder to make good public policy with bad science, or no science," I would add as an addendum to this. So as Kathy set the stage, what we're looking at here are these muck fields, which are just to the northeast of Bear Lake, which flows into Muskegon Lake. And Bear Lake is eutrophic. It's got a lot of nutrients, and it's also susceptible to harmful algal blooms. And why are we concerned about this? Well, there's a total maximum daily load, or a TMDL, on Bear Lake, which identifies phosphorus as being the impairment. And also, as Kathy said, there's a Muskegon Lake area of concern, beneficial use impairment dealing with eutrophication. Turns out that because of the wastewater treatment plant and redirecting a lot of our effluent to this, Muskegon Lake's water quality has improved dramatically. But Bear Lake remains a problem. In fact, Bear Lake has an average total phosphorus concentration of about 45 to 60 micrograms per liter, and the TMDL calls for it being reduced to about 30. So a 50 to 100% reduction in the phosphorus there. So the question is, are these muck fields that are next to or just upstream of Bear Lake a significant source of phosphorus to Bear Lake? And if so, as we restore these muck fields, what can we do to keep the phosphorus from getting into the lakes? And this is where the science comes into play, because we wanted to investigate how important particularly the sediments were, because we knew the water column had a lot of phosphorus, but where is it coming from? So if we take a close-up of this, we see there are two ponds that make up these. Now, originally these were wetlands, natural wetlands, but then they went into agricultural production in the early part of the 20th century. They were drained by pumps and turned into celery farms. And then when the celery production went out of business in the late 20th century, they were reflooded when the pumps were turned off. They're not hydrologically connected to each other. They have this road that goes through them. And you can see Bear Creek flows just to the north of them, and they are separated from Bear Creek, at least surface flow is separated, by this earthen berm. And then Bear Lake is just below this. There's about 50 to 100 yards of basically a cattail wetland right here. And so if we start looking at the restoration design, one of the designs is to take these berms out, let the flow come into the pond, basically recreate the wetland, and then slowly flow through here, come back out, go under Witham Drive, and then enter the West Pond, flow through here, come back out, and hopefully that phosphorus coming in from Bear Creek would be treated, so by the time it gets back out here, it would be relatively low concentrations. But let's look at what the phosphorus concentrations are in the water column of these systems. Now remember, for Bear Lake, we want to get down to 30. Bear Creek is 30 right now, but the East Pond is about 80, and the West Pond is 850. Now, the East Pond had been dredged, which is one reason why it's lower than the West Pond. So we know that the water column is rich with phosphorus. But if you reconnect, maybe that phosphorus from the water column flows out, and you get this one-time flush of phosphorus, and everything's hunky-dory. Unless the sediments are continuing to act as a reservoir of phosphorus, in which case they'll continue to pump phosphorus into these systems for a long period of time. And so that's what we wanted to investigate, how important these sediments were as a source of phosphorus. Will they serve as a sink or a source as we go through the restoration design? So the project elements were to examine phosphorus in the sediments and conduct simulated hydrologic connection experiments. This was part of my graduate student's master's thesis. James is in the back, if you can raise your hand, James. So I'm going to be showing a lot of James's data. So thank you for allowing me to share this. So the first thing we looked at was the phosphorus in the sediments, the Porewater phosphorus. This is the bioavailable phosphorus, and we use these peepers that we put into the sediment, and we can use them to look at the phosphorus concentrations. And what I want you to show, I'm just showing you the west pond, the really high phosphorus pond. This red line represents the interface between the water column. Everything above the red is in the water. Everything below is in the sediment. And we're looking at the soluble or the bioreactive phosphorus in milligrams per liter. So here's the target for Bear Lake, 30 micrograms in the dashed line. And this is what the concentrations are we're getting in the Porewater, up to 3,000 or 4,000 micrograms per liter at this site, and up to 8,000 to 10,000 micrograms per liter of phosphorus at this other site. And remember, our target is 30. So there's a lot of phosphorus in the sediment. Not surprising. I mean, these were former celery fields. They were fertilized. They're peat sediments, so they're naturally rich in P. But this is really alarming. I mean, this is dairy effluent concentrations. So if this starts bleeding into the water column and into the lake, we're going to exacerbate the problems in Bear Lake, not solve them. So what would happen then if we know there's a lot of P in the sediment. What happens then if we reconnect them? And so we basically did a simulation of the reconnection using sediment core tubes, which you can see here. We would take the sediment cores from the ponds and then put either Bear Creek water in them to simulate the reconnection or the pond water to represent the ambient conditions. So those were the two treatments. We did this last July and October. And we also looked at the ambient temperature. We basically put these in these incubators and incubated them at the ambient temperature, which we collected them, or we added 2 degrees Celsius to simulate climate change to see what the impacts were. So this is, again, here's what the sediment cores look like. Here's a cartoon of this core tube. The sediment is in brown at the bottom. The water is at the top, so you either have the pond water going back into it or the Bear Creek water going on top of it at either the ambient temperature or plus 2 degrees Celsius. And each core tube or each treatment was replicated 6 times. And show you some of the data. So I want to start off at the bottom, showing you these lines with the triangles, the open triangles. And this is the Bear Creek water on top of the West Pond sediment. And we start off low. Remember, that water from Bear Creek is about 30 micrograms per liter. But we quickly go up to either about 1,500 to 2,000 micrograms per liter or about 1,500 micrograms, depending upon whether we're at ambient temperature or 2 degrees Celsius higher. If we look at putting the pond water back on the sediments, this is sort of the ambient or control conditions, it still goes up from about 2,000 to 2,500 micrograms per liter. Remember, our Bear Lake target is 30. So if we put Bear Creek water, if we took these berms out and hydrologically reconnected without dealing with anything, there's going to be a huge amount of phosphorus coming out of these sediments into the water column, eventually getting into Bear Lake. This is a problem when we start talking about restoration design strictly for habitat. We need to take water quality into consideration. So based on this, we see that hydrologic connection results in a significant net phosphorus release. And these legacies from prior land use, in this case agriculture, must be taken into consideration for these restoration designs. So the question is, as part of this, what would be the impact from, we know that the phosphorus is rich in the sediments, we know if we put Bear Creek water in, we're going to get a huge flush out, but how much does this mean relative to the TMDL on Bear Lake? And so we did some scenarios. We took the phosphorus release rates from our experimental work in the growth chambers, and we took a maximum amount of release and the minimum amount of release. We then looked at loading duration coming out of the sediments as either a quarter of the year, half the year, or 3/4 of the year. We didn't assume that loading occurred through the whole year because in the winter this kind of shuts down. This is temperature driven because it's metabolic reactions. And so when ice covers this, things really shut down. But we didn't know if it would last for a quarter, half, or 3/4. So we wanted to look at that variation. And then finally, once this phosphorus comes out of the sediment into the pond and it gets into the creek, how much of that actually reaches Bear Lake? So we estimated either 10%, 50%, or all of it reaching the lake, because there's going to be some uptake and there's going to be some adsorption, but we don't know how much. So we looked at these various scenarios and came up with what the minimum or maximum amount of loading would be out of these ponds into Bear Lake. And the minimum is about 10 pounds per year. That's assuming we have the least amount of reaction rate over the shortest amount of time, and most of it is taken up to 960 pounds per year. This would be the maximum release rate over the 3/4 of the year, and all of that reaches Bear Lake. And the reality is going to be somewhere in between. But what does this mean relative to the TMDL for Bear Lake? Well, the TMDL calls for half of the load coming from the watershed to be reduced, which would be 800 pounds per year. So there's about 1,600 pounds per year coming out of the watershed right now, reaching the lake. TMDL calls for that to go down to 800. So this is either good news or bad news, depending on how you look at it. The good news is if we're able to capture all of that phosphorus coming out of the ponds due to mitigation strategies, then we're going to actually hit this target for external load reduction. That's good. The bad news is if we don't get it, then we can actually double the amount that's coming into the lake right now. And it would really create more of a problem than we currently have, and it'll stimulate even more algal blooms than we have, and it'll keep us from getting this BUI removed from Muskegon Lake area of concern and keep us from being delisted. So the management implications, the restoration plan must consider the former land use. We have to include phosphorus mitigation as part of these restoration designs, and monitoring the impacts are essential for post-restoration. If we're going to do adaptive management as part of these restoration efforts, if we don't have the monitoring data, how are we going to know what to adapt to? I mean, we need this kind of information. It's critical in order to make sure we can evaluate success and change our plans if we're not achieving the goals that we thought. And this is not unique to these Bear Lake muck fields. First of all, these kind of muck fields are all throughout the Great Lakes. There's a lot of wetlands that went into agricultural production that are now being taken out for restoration, and they have these legacies, and we need to account for this. And of course, these kinds of restoration projects throughout the Great Lakes need this kind of monitoring activity to evaluate success. So finally, I'll leave you with why science is important, and I like this quote too. William Gladstone, who was basically the treasurer of Great Britain in the 1850s before he became prime minister, was querying Michael Faraday, a famous physicist, about the practical value of electricity because he did not see the value. And so Mr. Faraday responded to William Gladstone as, oh, that's not going to do it. One day, sir, you may tax it. And so the reality is that as we improve water quality in these systems, we may not be able to tax the purity of our water, but it's going to improve, as Kathy showed, improve our property values. It's going to return an investment on these kinds of ecosystem restorations, and ultimately that will be an improvement in the economic engine of the Great Lakes. And I just want to acknowledge our funding sources, the Wilbrant family for allowing us access, and then the people who worked on this project, my postdoc Geraldine, the lab technicians Mary Ogdahl, and Maggie Weiner, and there's James with a fair amount of vegetation from Muskegon Lake. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Al. Okay, before we go to questions, just wanted to real briefly spend a little bit of time talking about climate adaptation issues. Al obviously already touched on that in the context of the, in particular, the Bear Creek hydrologic connection with the muck fields there. So wanted to expand on this a little bit more. NWF was involved in a project funded by NOAA and the Kresge Foundation over the last few years, looking at adaptation in the Great Lakes region, basically incorporating, updating some guidance material that we produced a couple of years ago. And in this case, we was looking at guidance to adaptation in the region, and in particular focusing on 7 case studies where we looked at the issues of climate adaptation and restoration projects around the basin. And one of the projects was the Muskegon Lake AOC project. So we got involved in assessing kind of the adaptation implications of 2 of the areas, the muck fields, the Hydrologic Reconnection project, and the mill debris site that Kathy mentioned in the South Muskegon Lake. Through this process, we gained some insights, and we basically updated the guidance document in this past spring, released the report, which is available online there on the left. And through that process, we also kind of modified the restoration, the overall approach, the schematic approach that we figured was important in following in restoration and thinking about adaptation issues. And that's identified in the figure there on the right. Basically, a number of steps involved that, as we saw it, obviously initially early on, you you have restoration goals and targets and approaches, you identify a climate smart, what we're calling a climate smart process to addressing those. I mean, climate change poses direct threats, risks to ecosystems, whether it's warmer water temperatures, otherwise, but there can also be impacts to other stresses, existing stresses, like Al mentioned in terms of the nutrients in the muck field. So we need to address all of those. Also looking at the important third part of that is looking at the climate change vulnerability. So that includes the exposure, say warmer temperatures, the sensitivity of an area to changing climate, and adaptive capacity of, say, particular species or an area to climate change. Then as needed, this is something that's kind of a newer way of thinking in a lot of ways, but is going back and looking at your original goals and objectives and seeing whether any of those you might have to change, tweak because of the information you have on climate change and potential impacts to the system. If, with warming climate, changing, say, water levels, temperatures, that kind of thing, an original objective may be very difficult to attain when we're looking out decades in advance. So that's an important part of it. Then step 5 is to identify and select the climate smart restoration options, and then develop a monitoring approach. As Al mentioned, that's quite crucial to have really in any kind of project, but in particular in a climate change context, and then implement the restoration options and keep the monitoring and then reviewing, revising as necessary going forward. In terms of exposures, climate indicators that we've seen in the region recently, and this is in region as in West Michigan, I looked at some of the data available, and it runs over different time frames, but typically back to the 40s or even earlier 20th century. But in general, we've seen generally warming air temperatures, as you can imagine. Total annual precipitation, at least a couple of the sites, actually was increasing a bit through the 20th century. Total annual wind speed was decreasing a bit, although it's interesting because some of the gusts, the shorter period gusts, to say 2-minute top wind speeds, were actually increasing a little bit over that period. Water temperatures, in particular in the winter, have been increasing a bit. Water levels, not surprisingly, have been quite mixed, but overall there's been a general decline in water levels, in particular in Lakes Michigan and Huron, through the 20th century for different reasons that have been studied, including by the IJC, in fact, an effort that Al was involved in. And it's interesting just how dynamic this is. We know going forward things are going to be very dynamic, but we've had these historically low levels just in the past 5 years or so, and then with this past winter now, all of a sudden levels are up quite a bit. So it's really a dynamic system.